Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MassASPA Book Talk. My name is Seth Meyer, and I'm so happy to be joined by my three amazing colleagues as today we talk about public performance and management. So I want to start off just by introducing each one of you. And I'll start off with Marc Holzer, who my former dean. And it's hard to do an intro for you because you've just done so much over your career, over 600 articles, 75 books, edited how many journals and started how many journals, and is the founding dean of Rutgers University Newark, and now professor emeritus at Suffolk University, and still coming out with books like the Public Productivity and Performance Handbook. And, you know, I always hear that professors don't retire, they just stop teaching. And, you know, you're still going at it, as we can see in the background. So amazing to have you with us. We also,
Thank you.
And we also have Andrew Ballard, a senior research associate with the National Center for Public Performance. You a lecturer of public administration at Rutgers University Newark School of Public Affairs and Administration, where you also got your PhD. And Dr. Ballard's research and practice focuses on the adoption and use of performance management systems in public organizations and the cognition of performance information among public services. And you received your PhD in 2018. Good year. And of course, Dr. Aroon Manoharan, who's an associate professor at the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And your research interests include e-government, performance measurement, strategic planning, public communication, and comparative public administration. Your books have included e-government and information technology management concepts and best practices, as well as e-government and websites, a public solution handbook. A lot of amazing work on e-government, which is such an understudied and such an important area. Dr. Manoharan, received his PhD from Rutgers University Newark and MPA from Kansas State University. All roads go back to Rutgers University. So thank you for joining us. And I have a bunch of questions ready, but if anyone has any questions, you can either put them in the chat or there will be time to ask questions as well. So my first question is, what are the trends in public performances in public organizations over the past few years? And I know, especially over the past few years, you know, we can't talk about any of this without asking, how's COVID impacted these, if they have? So, Dr. Holzer, do you want to start?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Seth. Yeah, I appreciate the introduction. I just want to note that, you know, most of what I've done has been in collaboration with doctoral students, with faculty, with others. I think I'm very big on being more productive by being more collaborative, in a sense. But, in terms of performance, I think what we've seen in the last few years is that measurement has really become a very prominent part of this effort, maybe too big a part. So there are many more sophisticated approaches to how to measure what governments have promised to deliver to their citizens. But measurement isn't the whole ball game, in a sense. Measurement is just the first step, in a way. So I think to some extent the field has been out of balance, tilted towards measurement, and some programs are just teaching measurement without really linking it to improvements. So my biggest concern is how to rebalance the field, how to really make it more impactful in a sense. So that's my initial thought as to what, and that's what led us to this third edition of the handbook, and in substantial part. So, okay, so
Andrew or Aroon, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Happy to go. Thanks for the question, Seth. It's nice to see everyone. Nice to see you, Brenda. It's been a really long time since we've seen each other. Nice to see friendly faces. So I think in response to this, I think it's fair to say that the idea of performance management, even if it's sometimes not called that, is reasonably ubiquitous these days across all levels of government. I do think sometimes academia makes things a little more complicated than they are, because performance is really just keeping track of what you're doing and trying to do it better, and those concepts are rather deeply ingrained, at least in the nomenclature and in a lot of the work. But in terms of trends that I've observed, as of late, I think that the big trend that I often observe is the expansion of performance management into new or less common or less historically considered functional areas of government. And you can see this in examples from throughout the book. There's examples of applying performance principles to human resources and professional development, and managing developmental efforts in emerging economies, child welfare, family services, and the list goes on and on. I think the challenge this presents, though, is adapting a process that was largely based on functional areas of government that are operationally and conceptually clear, things like transportation, infrastructure, sanitation, things where the outputs and outcomes are clear, measurable. You have specific control over the inputs and outputs, and then there's very little external forces at play when you're measuring your outcomes. Moving though to functions that are harder to measure and even harder still to attribute the direct effectiveness of the government intervention. So those are kind of the trends. And then I think on the COVID point specifically, I think like many extreme events, it served to pretty clearly identify high and low performing governments, rather than creating fundamentally new issues or needs in the performance space. Those are the existing data collection processes and capacity and established routines on changing processes were much better positioned to respond to the crisis, to be able to meet the data requirements for their federal government authorities. And there's a party going on. And then provide reliable and transparent information to their citizens. So rather than sort of creating new needs in performance, I think it showed who does it well and who doesn't do it so well.
So yes, thank you everybody for joining. I think that we are in a time where we need to really kind of rethink how we approach performance measurement. It has worked, when it was introduced with the Government Performance Results Act. It had a great impact. It's largely served the purpose, and I think it's also time to enhance it, see how we can integrate performance measurement with other initiatives, that is improving the performance, right? Strategic planning and trying to relate the performance to stakeholders, right? How do you communicate to performance? So we are in this age, we are in this DRIP age, right? The DRIP syndrome, DRIP, data-rich, information poor. So how do you make sense of the data? That is, the data is available. There's compared to about 10 years, 20 years back, we have a large amount of data. So I think the focus should shift to how do we link the performance data to performance improvement. So look at the system as a whole. How do we link it to strategic planning? Instead of strategic planning, performance measurement happening as two different in silos. How do you integrate it, and how do you connect it to communication? Communication, especially, different communication is not just a one-way channel. It has to be two-way, and there has to be different ways of communication and engaging stakeholders, right? Just an example, the storytelling is an increasing trend among cities. How cities are hiring even digital storytellers. So how do you narrate your performance? So I think some creativity is needed to enhance the performance measurement system. Just a couple of things, and then we can come back to the initiatives. At the federal level, a couple of initiatives was the the Performance Enhancement Reform Act, which was passed in April 2021. And the goal here, and this act actually has introduced quite a few innovative steps, like, for example, requiring agencies to have a chief performance officer, and trying to build in the capacity linking performance measurement to human resources. So that's one initiative. And then from the GAO side, there has been a shift towards the CAP goals, which is the cross-agency priority goals. So the focus is more on developing the goals, even appointing managers in charge for each goal, and then trying. So once you're clear with the goals, then you can decide what resources you need to achieve these goals. So there is reform happening with the new administration at the federal level, and but also at the various levels of government. There is a need to rethink how performance measurement is done. So.
That's fantastic. And building off of that, why don't we jump ahead a little bit to from the prepared questions, but what programs and public performances have been successful or unsuccessful, both federal, state, and local level? So anyone want to?
I'll start off with that. Again, Seth. I think the successful programs have probably been more at the local state level. Well, Fairfax County, for example, I think is a successful program. Austin, Texas, in terms of performance auditing, particularly, is an exemplar. The state of Washington is an example. I think there are a lot of positive examples of performance improvement programs out there, but we don't know what all of them are. A lot of them are under the radar, haven't been written up as case studies, aren't really discussed at conferences. I think some of the failures, in my opinion, have been, let's say, New York City, which has for decades had an office of operations and a mayor's management report and many measures. I think has just become a compendium of data that's published on a habitual basis. I'm not aware of any linkages really to to improvement. Though CompStat in the police department, for a while was that kind of exemplar. There are many programs that have been tried as sort of a function of a fad at the time, and then disappeared over time. Washington, D.C., Detroit, for example. And I think that's evidence that politicians lose interest. They don't really understand what, all the parts that you need for a performance program. And then when the administration changes, they tend to want to, throw out what their predecessors have done and somehow try to reinvent the wheel in a sense. I think at the federal level, performance has become ingrained, but I think more or less as an efficiency improvement program with not enough emphasis on outcomes. Sense what citizens want outcomes. They're not really concerned with what's going on behind the scenes. In general, this goes. They just assume that somehow government should be, efficient, and efficient will lead to effectiveness. And this goes back over 100 years to the good government movement and management science, et cetera, and, circa 1900 and, years that followed for decades. So what we're trying to do with performance is really fulfill government's promises and say, okay, government is performing at a high level. It's not only efficient, but it has the impacts that you wanted in the first place. So if you think of the public schools, there's a lot of discussion of what, whether we're generating the impacts that we want. if you look at Biden's infrastructure program, there's assumptions there that somehow all these programs are going to make us more competitive with China, which is what we, make our, our society more impactful in terms of worldwide economics. And I think there's a dotted line there. It's not necessarily going to happen the way they think it might, though I hope it does in a way. So so in terms of what a successful program is and how it's evaluated, it's it's not easy to do it, but I would say if you look at the programs that have been around for decades, that have been institutionalized, they're worth looking at as models you might want to apply in your own organization. And when you go through this book, there are dozens and dozens of models that are suggested, by the authors of the various chapters that are worth following up on the on those websites, because they've been fine-tuning the model as they go along. So I think the book, in terms of bringing to the surface various models, various logic models, as well as service delivery models, is a valuable asset that can help you, and no matter what organization you're in, and no matter what you're doing in that organization. So, I think looking at the book, probably the online, the electronic copy, which is affordable as opposed to the print copy, which is probably not. The library is only buying that. Would be a good investment with a high payoff, because of the opportunity to look at those models in a sense. So, okay, I'll stop there, Seth.
It's great, and I just want to let everyone know that I did put a link to the Routledge website for the book in the chat, the Public Productivity and Performance Handbook. So if you're interested, you can find it on Routledge or Amazon. Yeah,
I agree with. Well, let's pray for a Black Friday deal on this hardcover book. So it's a little pricey. I agree with a lot with what Marc said. I think some specific references in the book for those who have it or are interested. Here at Buchert has a really, I think there is overall a really kind of lovely dialogue on both conceptually how do we evaluate the performance of governments and the concept of performance management. And here at Buchert has a really nice chapter on some reflections on that. And then also I think there is a very honest dialogue about what goes wrong and what hasn't worked. And I would point people towards chapters like that written by Van Badzik, who is one of the leaders of the King County, Washington performance system, which is largely considered one of sort of the marquee, longstanding performance systems in the country, and kind of why these strategic initiatives fail. In terms of successful cases, I do agree with, Marc opened up by saying you see all these failures. The funny thing about evaluating government performance is oftentimes you only see things when they go wrong. You know when things go really, really wrong because something really, really bad happens. And oftentimes a really high performing government is also a very boring government. They don't make the news, so it's quite difficult to assess. But some I think good examples across a couple different ways you might assess government performance. One on just sort of pure operational efficiency and service quality, sort of the root foundations of city stat and that model. I think you would want to turn to the Cleveland Regional Transit Authority. They're a really wonderful example of taking a performance stat like city stat or comp stat and turning and applying it to transportation, another model of service delivery. They've observed market improvements in on-time rates and vehicle reliability and fuel expenditures. And they went a full 8 years without having to raise fares, which is unheard of in American public transportation. I think the second is thinking about sort of organizational integration and comprehensiveness across sort of a whole of government approach. And I think you would want to look at the city and county of San Francisco and their city scorecard initiative, which they focus less so on individual programmatic areas in measuring performance, but looking at cross-cutting themes like public health, safety net, environment, and how a whole of government approach attacks that or addresses those issues and sets targets for themselves, sort of forcing themselves to integrate different areas of the government and setting up performance measures along that integration. And then the final example I would give is in the area of transportation. And I think this is particularly salient at the moment. And I encourage everyone to go check out Montgomery County, Maryland's COVID surveillance system. And not only does it provide really excellent data on cases, capacity, and response, but it details the exact metrics which are vetted by the public health experts that the county tracks in order to make public health decisions. Not only is that process transparent and rigorous, but they hold themselves accountable to those performance metrics that they really don't need to hold themselves accountable. There's an enormous political risk in making decisions around COVID. And I think the perfect example is my city where I live, Washington, D.C. On Mondays lifting there, we are experiencing what is likely a sixth wave of COVID, and D.C. is the same as the rest of the country. And on Monday, D.C. is lifting its mask mandate, but across just 5 minutes up the road, Montgomery County is reinstating theirs on Monday because their surveillance metrics are such that they meet the requirements for reenacting a mask mandate. So it's really a nice example of setting standards, holding yourself accountable to those standards, being transparent about process, and being really responsive to the needs of the public, even when they may not be the easiest political decisions to make, which often is perhaps a challenge in performance. Is good decisions for efficiency and equity are sometimes not good political decisions, and we can have a whole conversation around political turnover and its implications. But I'll stop there.
So yeah, these are great examples. I'll just probably add a couple of examples and also share some ideas on where to look for some good, how to identify good performance measures. I think the city of Seattle is a good example. King County is also a good example because, like what I said, they focus on not only performance measurement, but they also focus on integrating strategigic planning. There is a division of strategic planning. So there is this, in fact, the office itself is called performance, I think the name is Performance Strategy and Services, but the focus, they do recognize the importance of strategic planning with performance measurement and data visualization. Everything is on the performance dashboard, and they clearly indicate that they use data to improve the lives, improve the quality of living in the region. So that is one example. Virginia Performs is another example at the state level. Again, the focus is on the quality of living. So improving, I think the best, one thing that is a unique feature of the best cases is that they clearly show how they're using the data and for what, right? So it is the performance improvement. Another aspect on how to identify best cases is I was thinking also the PAFers and the KFers, right? Performance reporting. We again focus a lot on performance measurement, but if you think of the performance report, how do you communicate performance? So performance reporting, popular annual financial reports, PAFER, and the comprehensive annual financial reports. The GFOA, every year they bring out best practices in performance reporting. They give out annual awards to cities and counties and also states based on their performance reporting practices. So there should be a link to performance reporting and performance improvement, and so that's something that we should look more. I think that's we don't really look into a lot of these best practices. Then there is also now on the international, there should be a platform for sharing best practices, right? For example, on the international scale, you have an organization called WEGO. WEGO, that is a World E-Government Organization, and the platform provides best practices for cities which are in the beginning stages of e-government and mobile government. So you have best cases like the city of Seoul, also the city of Prague, being showing how best to implement e-government initiatives, right? So maybe there should be a platform to share best practices and to learn from others' experiences. So,
can I just add, Seth, just picking up on what Aroon Manoharan said. I think that public health may be the best case, in front of us, not just today, because of COVID, but really the ability of our various societies to thrive is based on the assumption that we can actually address public health concerns. Because in the past, you see that large segments of populations have been wiped out because of not just pandemics that we know about, but others that we haven't known about over time. So public health is, in my view, the number one line of defense for populations and for what government promises to do. Now you just fast forward, to 2021, and you find that public health is critically important to all of our lives, because you can just see the implications of the pandemic, but you can also see that the way this has been approached deals with all the factors that we've got in the book. I mean, in part it's technology, in part it's human resources, because you need people, to address these problems, not just in the hospitals, but the nursing homes, let's say, teachers who are willing to go into the schools. In part it's psychology, because people have to be willing to, to extend themselves some, be willing to wear masks, be willing to, to get inoculated without fear. In part, it's politics, because there's a lot of political manipulation going on in terms of resisting this. It makes no sense, but it's a tactic that's being used. In part, it's financial, in terms of how it's rippled through our entire society and our tax structure and such. And in part it's a failure to look at best practices. Like we published a compendium of best practices in the American Review of Public Administration, ARPA, in 2019. And I think that may have helped inform the public administration community about that, but I don't think there's been enough study of innovations and exemplary programs around the world that could help the United States, or where other countries should be looking around the world. And okay, so public health, I think, is the way to begin to look at a comprehensive system, but it also underscores the fact that there's international best practices, international sources of learning that we can find out. But we have a whole chapter in the book about how to find best practices, for example, a chapter I wrote with Patria Jones. And so we need to look around the world. You can't live in a silo. The US is a silo. It's a big silo, right? China is another big silo. Let's say India is a big silo, but we need to say what works and how do we adapt that to our individual societies. And the same thing, what works in Massachusetts might not work in Texas, but Texas could learn a lot from some of the things that are going on in Massachusetts. Et cetera. So worldwide cases, public health as a model, and the resources of best practices are three things that I think connect directly with the book. So.
Great, and building on Marc, what you just said about areas that are really under researched, one of the big questions is always, what is there left to research? And it seems like there's quite a bit. So what research questions do you three still have about public management and performance? Andrew?
Yeah, I have a couple. I mean, I think one is something that was already mentioned, and there is a scholarship on it, but I don't, there is little evidence to suggest that the scholarship is moving the practice in this particular area, which is the influence of political turnover on the adoption and sustainment of performance systems. I think one question is on isolating performance management processes from political turnover. Could we have, for example, could we have prevented Baltimore city staff from languishing after Mayor O'Malley left, or could we have prevented Governor Hogan of Maryland from largely mothballing Maryland state staff again after O'Malley departed? Maybe it's an O'Malley problem. But can these initiatives develop and take hold even in the absence of political sponsorship? Again, I think I'd revert to folks in the practice who have had these longstanding systems, folks who wrote chapters like Van Badzik on why they fail, Lyle Ray, who wrote a chapter on launching and sustaining performance management systems. I think there is a nice 2-chapter series, which rethinking it now, I might have swapped their order. But there's a chapter on sort of a matrix of characteristics and qualities that are necessary standards for the sustainment of a successful performance management system. And then Lyle Ray provides a series of sort of precursor measures and are an assessment you can conduct of your organization to understand where your existing deficiencies and where you need to focus your performance efforts. And all of that work itself is done at the staff level. And then I think the big question, as always, is does it work? Can CompStat reduce crime? Can a CompStat-like model reduce crime, or is it always susceptible to perverse incentives and quotas? And can public health performance management systems improve, community health outcomes? I think there's a really nice literature that assesses self-reported measures of organizational performance and the adoption of performance management systems, but trying to figure out, does it drive outcomes? Does the adoption and implementation of these systems fundamentally change the performance of a government? I think are 2 areas that are still, there's a lot of work to be done in the scholarship.
So yeah, I think there are a lot of actually, so both of you mentioned some really good insights, and so continuing the discussion, it is important that we look at global and comparative performance measurement systems, because one thing to remember is many of the systems have adopted some of the, for example, the GIPRA Act, right? Similar to the GIPRA Act, there are federal initiatives in different countries. So it'll be very interesting to see how it has taken shape in different countries, and probably there are some lessons from there. How performance measurement is perceived in different countries. For example, in India, the focus is more on monitoring, outcome monitoring. They have the output and outcome monitoring framework. So, and similarly in other countries, it's probably program evaluation. So the same thing exists in different forms. May not call it performance measurement, but the focus is on something else, on monitoring, on evaluation. So looking at those and trying to see how different is that, and the terms also matter, right? How do you share performance measurement, performance management? That is something that I would like to research. How this can improve the motivation, like reporting performance internally. How can it improve the motivation of employees, right? Like, for example, the report cards. We all know the report cards in schools, and some cities have these report cards, and that can have a positive effect. A simple idea, but it will definitely have some kind of a positive effect on the citizens. So that's something I'm interested in researching. And going back to my area, e-government, I think I would like to see more integration of performance measurement with e-government, because the goal of performance measurement is to improve performance. And there are many other strategies that have been introduced to improve performance, like e-government. And if you go back, even managerialism and business process reengineering, all these tools are all to improve the performance. So we need to look at how to develop indicators for that. Right now, the latest, of course, is the AI, digital, and then there's a digital transformation, smart cities. how do you integrate performance measurement with these digital innovations? So these are questions I would like to explore.
Yeah, can I just add that I think there's one important question we have never addressed, which is can performance save money or increase income in terms of governmental budgets? So what politicians are interested in as much as anything else is how they can finance, government, how they can save money, and claim, and tout that to their constituents, but how they can stretch resources. Now you see it's going on in terms of Biden's Build Back Better bill here. What's going to be the relationship between that and and how you finance government, long term, or with the infrastructure bill, the same thing. How do you pay for things, right? So, so we've got to sort of broaden the research into performance. Say not only is it improving outcomes, but it can alleviate the pressure on budgets, or it can create ways of increasing income going forward, or reducing stress. The stress on the budget is from demand for services by avoiding problems. So I think that's a big area of research that hasn't really been addressed. We have section 4 in the book on financing performance, but that's that really dances around this question. So but the income increase or the expenditure avoidance, questions are important because we need political support, and we need politicians to say every unit of government should have a performance program, and it should be adequately funded, and it's the best investment that they can make. So how do we prove that?
If I could add, raising government revenues, performance in the effort to raise government revenues, I think presents a really fascinating dilemma, because there is a really well-established and growing literature from groups like the behavioral insights teams and their sort of counterparts, and raising that do work to raise revenue. Really brilliantly constructed randomized controlled trials to try. But here's the problem: that they try to get people to increase the rate at which they will pay parking fees or traffic tickets or pay back water bills, like they focus on fee collection. And as we all know, raising the rates at which individuals pay their fees disproportionately harms those of the lowest income brackets in our communities. So it's always this balance of wanting to raise revenue but do it equitably and not having all of these unintended consequences, because you can double the rate at which people pay their traffic tickets, but if that makes them skip out on paying for prescription drugs, is that an actual outcome that we would want to achieve in our communities?
And that's really fascinating. There's a lot here internationally, government, just kind of what works and what doesn't, the outcomes. I think that when we think of public performance, sometimes we think of it so minimally and so specifically, but it's such a broad and complicated and fascinating area, as you have all shown in the book. Now, building off of all of this, we have some students here, and what do you recommend? And I'm going to change this question a little bit. I apologize from my original intent. But what would you recommend for researchers, for PhD students who want to get into this, or even for professionals who would like to research their own organization? Any recommendations?
To research their own organization, in what way, Seth?
Well, looking at public performance and measurements to kind of, building on a couple of things that we've talked about earlier, to research to see if the measurements are working, how their own performance, and if it's really financially worth it to do these kind of measurements.
I think that what they should do is, look at a few best practice cases out there, and see, if you take a deep dive into any particular cases that's mentioned, let's say Fairfax County or Washington State, whatever, or maybe New Zealand. And we have a whole chapter on New Zealand in here. The more you explore one particular case, the more I think you might understand about what goes wrong, what goes right, in a sense. But that means taking a deep dive in and maybe doing an in-depth paper along those lines. But in the chapter on best practices, we've got keywords that can be used to identify those cases and particular service areas or just slicing it up different ways. But I think depth is a good way to do it, and that way you could come pretty close to what it is you are actually managing, in terms of applicability. But you might find something around the world or across the country or across the street, whatever that was, that you never knew about, that might be a good model. And to borrow a phrase from the 60s, steal this book, it's like you could just take those ideas that are out there for the taking. Generally this stuff, in terms of what you need to do to apply to your own program, is out there if you just have the patience to do a lot of web searching, downloading, reading, and looking for the the subtleties, and you'll find pretty much a step-by-step manual for what it is you need to do, where you could build your own. That would really it would pay off. It would have it's got a pretty high payoff function that way. So that's my suggestion.
I think that they're different. The advice would be a little different for working professionals as they would for, if we say, like PhD candidates. For example, working professionals who want to start, I would start by saying it's really not as it's people. I think if set the right expectations, it's really not as hard as you think it is. It's start with things that are conceptually clear, where you can collect reliable data, and oftentimes that starts with internal organizational processes, like how long it takes on average for you to respond to a press inquiry, for example, in a mayor's PR office. Those are ripe for exploration and assessment, and then adding the requisite skills in that, which are unfortunately oftentimes not taught in MPA programs or PA programs, which is like applied management research type of skills, process assessments and workflow mapping. I mean, an author that we have has essentially made his career on taking Lean Six Sigma manufacturing processes and implementing them in the public space, which are just pretty simple. Figuring out what the pain points in your business processes are, get a room together and think about resolving those pain points. And you don't need to be a data analyst to do it. It helps, but it's not required. I think on the PhD student side of things, I think it's very hard to study government from an office at a university. I think if you want your work to be relevant, I think you need to make an effort to go out there and do the work itself, take paid or even unpaid consulting gigs at state and county governments. They are screaming for help, someone just to go in there and help out, and you can gain valuable insights on the day-to-day stresses and barriers that public servants face in trying to adopt these performance regimes. I mean, the scholars that I most respect, like Seth Seth worked in social work before he started his PhD, so he knows in depth the sort of the conditions that people work in. And people like Marc and Don Moynihan, who are in a constant dialogue with the practice, although there's obviously in conflict with incentives in publication and in academia. But I think if you're able to strike that balance, you're headed for a pretty fruitful career.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of ideas that students can explore in this, especially with, like I mentioned before, in this state where we need to rethink the process. One is how the goals are measured, right? What goes into developing the performance goals, and who are the stakeholders? So looking at it from a stakeholder perspective is something would be a great research question. If does more involvement from citizens lead to more satisfaction? That could be something that students can measure. Then it could be I mean, I would encourage students to look at from an organizational perspective, the motivation levels of employees involved, and how does it impact the motivation, the culture, right? The organization culture, how is it impacted? Is there a performance culture? I mean, can you define what is a performance culture? How can you induce a performance culture? For example, that culture of continuous feedback, where feedback is not some off thing that it takes everybody by surprise or shock, but you're actually waiting for the feedback to improve. How can you induce that? And so structure is important. The leadership, looking at for example, the best case is looking at the leadership structure. Is there a chief, for example, is there a chief performance officer, or is there somebody who drives this? Is there a performance champion? I would encourage students. I know it's difficult, but it'll be great if they can go internally and look at maybe do some surveys of the employees there and see how does it impact motivation. And also the field. Also, we need to start thinking and integrating more with DEI. So how do you integrate DEI, diversity, equity, inclusiveness in performance measurement? This is something that how do you introduce measures for DEI, and how can DEI be introduced in the performance measurement system? That's something that we need to start thinking about. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Especially thank you, Andrew, the shout out. And Aroon, I love the idea of utilizing diversity, equity, inclusion. As a DEI scholar myself, I think that there's so much overlap. So thank you for that. I have one last question, and then we'll open it up. But if you want to ask a question, you can either message me, or put it directly in the chat, or we'll just open it up. But I'm at a teaching institute. My focus is teaching. So my big question is always, what are some of the ways we can teach public performance in public administration programs? And what should we be including in our classes?
Look, there's lots of different ways to do this. So at Suffolk, there's we now have a concentration on performance that Brenda is leading. At Rutgers, there were courses on performance, but also you could look at Florida State, University of Delaware, the Biden School, University of North Carolina with David Ammons, established performance courses, particularly in terms of benchmarking. The Evans School in Washington, the Truman School in Missouri. So there's references to all of these, particularly in that chapter with Andrew. So there are models out there in terms of how you teach performance, but you can also build performance into other classes. Pretty easy to build it into a research methods class, let's say, but it should also, I think, be built into the politics of administration classes, because politics are, can be a facilitator or an obstacle to a performance program, but also the HR course, and in terms of the behavioral side of this, it goes way back, and in terms of studies of the workforce and the Hawthorne experiments, etc. And public-private, partnerships can be this, that kind of course can, if there is one, can have significant performance part into it, or let's say, citizen-driven government performance, which we've done with the Sloan Foundation. And it's been meant, citizen participation was mentioned as well. Is another way to build it into courses. But I think in general, to make performance happen, you have to understand a whole spectrum of the concepts in terms of public administration, rather than just the, as I said at the beginning, the measurement, the more technical side of it. That's just the beginning. Frankly, there's a lot of data that organizations already collect. How do you use that data? Then how do you connect it to actual performance improvement? How do you make that performance improvement salient to the stakeholders, elected officials and citizens and the media, et cetera. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a place for performance and the whole curriculum. So
my response might, Mark might not like it. I think there is often an assumption in MPA programs specifically, and what I think to be largely an incorrect assumption is that MPA programs are training generalized leaders and managers who will leave the program and go into a management or leadership position. But more often than not, especially in non-executive MPA programs, an MPA or a master's is now a prerequisite for advancement within the staffing at the staff level. So I think the economy or the job availability is driving sort of the need for curriculum that might diverge from our preferences in delivering a holistic view of performance. If you look at job postings these days for performance analyst jobs in the public sector, you'll see things like intermediate to advanced experience in data analysis, or understanding being able to experience conducting applied management research like process and workflow analysis, or experience in managing or understanding enterprise data management systems or database architecture. It's very discrete and hard skills oriented, which may or may not be a good thing for the health and sustainability of the performance management system, but those seem to be the skills that are recruited for those positions. And at least in my experience, unfortunately, a lot of those jobs you have to get approval to go take those courses at the School of Business, for example. So, but I think to Mark's point, which I entirely agree, I think we need to find a balance, because the process is collecting data, obviously, to begin with, but you have to find a way to motivate or compel your colleagues to change the way they work once that data is collected. So things like change management and appreciation for sort of human resource dynamics and all that sort of stuff is also really, really important. But we find the struggle of students need a job, and the skills demanded by employers may not match our idealized view of what a fully fleshed performance manager might look like when they enter into the job market. So it's a tricky situation, I think, especially for MPA programs these days.
So yeah, I think it's very exciting to introduce performance measurement to students, because I got introduced to performance measurement. In fact, what got me interested was a historical focus on performance measurement. Right? If you go back to the Bureau of Municipal Research 100 years back, how cities, the municipal bureaus in Chicago, New York, and other cities, they actually started reporting performance in 1902, 1910, 1920. I think that's a fascinating way of teaching performance. Just going back how the city manager movement started, and what was important work done around that time, and that is now relevant to today's digital era. I think that students should know that. Going back to history, I mean, I love history, and I always like to bring in history in whatever I teach. There is a lot of history in public performance. That the whole era should be brought back, and there is also that how can they induce performance culture, right? As MPA students, for example, rather than focusing on training them to be performance measurement officers, because we don't know how many of those jobs are there, instead to train them to create that culture for performance and continuous feedback. So that is something I think that's something I would encourage. And also try to link performance with other courses. Like if you're teaching HR, there is definitely that link to performance. E-government, absolutely, there is a link to performance. Budgeting, how do you use performance informed budgeting? So these are ways that you can introduce performance in different aspects of the course. Yeah. And also I wanted to mention, you can even introduce performance measurement as skills, like what Andrew had mentioned, right? You need those skills, those hard skills. You can introduce those as certificate courses or 1-credit courses. Like, for example, at UMass Boston, we have 1-credit courses for MPA students. So MPA students are required to take 6 1-credit courses, which will be counted as 2 full semester courses. So these courses focus on applied skills like data analytics, strategic planning, GIS skills. So this is one way you can do, and these can be taught by practitioners. In fact, a lot of those courses are being taught by practitioners. So this is one example of how you can introduce students to performance measurement.
Just one final thought, Seth, is that I think the problem we've had with performance is it just kind of got painted into a corner where it's become somewhat of a quantitative, analytical, skill set, which is analogous to business practices, whereas I'd argue that all managers in government really need to understand performance, that they're all performance officers in a sense, but without that, that title. So we're preparing MPAs, and I think this is what part of what Andrew was saying, is that we're preparing them to be leaders in the organizations. We're preparing them to manage at a high level. They need to know what the possibilities are with performance management, and we need to distill the knowledge base so that they can measure it. Now, one of the problems we have is that most people managing in government have no training in management of public public organizations. So they come in through other routes. They might be lawyers, they might be medical doctors, right? They might be scientists, whatever, but they wind up in top level or middle level positions. So we need a way to help them master these competencies, of which performance per se is only part of what they should be doing, but everything they're doing relates to performance. And that's where you go back to the COVID case and how we fight COVID. You see that, I think, most clearly today. So I think, going back to Seth's questions, we need to sort of package performance, not just for MPA students, but for for a way for all managers in government to to really master it in some ways. So a lot of what the book deals with is really along those lines. So the book, if we could distill the book into lessons learned, in a sense, that might work. But if I could, I wanted to ask Melissa Williams, who has been through the book, so she is the one student who's been through it, because I did a reading course with her last spring, where she read the whole book just as we were about to publish it, right? So Melissa, if I could put you on the spot, if you could unmute yourself. I mean,
of course.
Did you think that what's in the book, is useful, is applicable, is something that all the people who manage with you, should be aware of? Or?
Absolutely. So I was actually reading this book when I began a new position as a management and planning analyst at the state government level. And I think something I'm struggling with, but I think the book has really helped me, is with getting the buy-in for best practices and really getting the support, especially looking on the international level. I think a lot of the times we focus on one specific issue or concern that we need to measure. A lot of the times it's for support of a new program or a new policy rollout to make sure that it is in fact effective. But then once we have the initial data, it kind of fizzles out the support. And so really figuring out how to sustain that support at the management level is something that I think public sector, especially at state government I'm experiencing, is struggling with at least. I feel like I could say so much more.
Okay, I didn't mean to really put you on the spot, but you were, you were a unique, student because you went through the whole book. You really mastered it. So,
to all my MPA colleagues on here, I would definitely recommend reading the book. It has definitely, challenged me to think about new topics and areas I've never thought about before: motivation, e-government, really just going through all the different aspects of performance, because I am a data analyst. And so that's what I always started off with viewing performance as, figuring out the right metrics to collect and measure and report out on, how we really get across those results and outcomes. But it's so much more than that. And I think that's where the book has really opened my eyes, and it's really applicable to public sector employees at all different levels.
okay, thank you.
But have your school's library buy it for you. If you got student debt, get someone else to buy it for you.
Yes. So now I would love to open it up to questions. There's been a lot of amazing points brought up about the book, but any questions that anyone has? And I see Brian, you have a question.
Hi, and thank you, Dr. Holzer, for joining us today. And I usually trust everything Melissa says, so that's a really good endorsement of the book. So I might be flipping through it soon. But the question I wanted to ask is, what are some strategies to develop a culture of performance management and analysis in your organization, particularly in programs that have been around for a while and either have outdated or no performance management? How do you get buy-in, and how do you assure employees that we're not sort of measuring you to eliminate you or change you? We're measuring you to learn.
Hey, Brian, I think you could do that in part with what you might say are performance management meetings. We're just group problem solving sessions with the different stakeholders, constituencies in the organization represented, and you say, look, here's the data, here are the trends in the data. What does it show, and what do you think that indicates about the priority opportunities for problem solving, and see what they come up with. And that way they, I think they'd feel some sense of ownership with the problem solving practice way. So I kind of like the idea of those meetings.
Thank you.
It's a really good question. I think there's a couple of references I would make. There's an author in the book, and you could explore his work elsewhere. His name is Brian Elms. He's a consultant at the moment. He stood up the city of Denver's Peak Academy, which is sort of the training and internal consulting group within the city of Denver's government that goes around and does performance consulting, process improvement type of work throughout. And he's developed a really, I think, a good sense of change management and changing organizational culture. And it very much corresponds or is similar to like Cotter's change management and leading change process involves creating sort of psychological safety. And I think one thing that if you ask Brian Elms, he'll say there's so much work to do and so many things you can work to improve. When you start out, start small. The former director of the Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, he said, don't try to hit a home run, hit like a ground roll triple. So, I don't know, some baseball reference. Don't swing for the fences, whatever the baseball reference is. Start small, find sort of clear opportunities to demonstrate that change is possible. And then the thing that Brian reinforces time and time again is work with people who are willing to say yes. There's going to be so many people that say no, and spinning your wheels on working with groups who have codified routines and codified perspectives, you're sort of going to waste your time, and there's so much other good work to be done. So find people willing to say yes, use those as case studies of success to demonstrate to everyone else in the organization that change is possible. And in that, you create a sense of psychological safety where you can be critical of your own work. So I think Brian Elm's chapter, he has a brilliant book on I forget the name, the cover, it has a bunch of sticky notes on it. It's sort of his thing. And then Kotter, Kotter, is I think a really nice author on this particular issue.
Thank you. I while you were talking, I looked it up and it's available on Amazon. So
Here it is
definitely
right
check
here.
that out.
Andrew, I just so happen to have it, right? Am I prepared or what?
Yeah, it's a fun read. He's a fun author.
It checks two major boxes for me. It's written by someone named Brian, and it's only $8 on Amazon. So thank you.
So I'll also add to that. I think these are great points, good question. And maybe if, one idea is to have some kind of a performance agreement, like maybe when you're introducing performance measurements in the organization, the manager can probably have a discussion, a conversation with the employee, this is what we want to do, rather than just coming in later on and then measuring the performance. And why don't you have the meeting in the beginning, have a conversation, and ask the employee, okay, what is your assessment of this? What do you think you can achieve, or what is reasonable, the expectation? So it should be a conversation, more the measurement. So that's one idea.
Thank you. I like the idea of it being a conversation.
Excellent, thank you. What about any other questions?
I've got one, Seth. If people are game for it, I'm feeling a little bit of the anarchist vibe in myself today, so I might throw a Molotov cocktail and see what happens. I guess that my concern here is that, especially thinking about some of the stuff that's coming up in, the new infrastructure bill and this sort of failure to learn, right, from the political side. Okay, we're gonna take a look at New Zealand, and we're gonna take a look at the fact that, the sort of, leasing or selling off public infrastructure to private companies. I can't remember what exactly it is they call it, right? But it's a revenue saving trick. And we're gonna not learn from New Zealand's experience with this problem. We're gonna bring it over here, and we're gonna do this because we can account for it, right? We can ascribe kind of these numbers to doing this. And I guess that my experience with performance management, and I come at this like, I used to work in public transportation. We had to build, our performance management system. And Andrew, I think you're exactly right. Start small. But what I came to experience was sort of analogous to a ratchet effect, right? That once you establish the metrics, right, the ratchet is then applied politically to your organization, so that you always are now called upon to become more efficient, right? And what we then have in public administration is we don't just have efficiency, we also have effectiveness, we also have equity, we also have all of these other things, which are much more slippery, I guess, when it comes to measurement. And so When I teach my students about this, right, performance management and measurement is vital. But my question to you is sort of like, how do we retain those other sort of values in our organization when there's always this political push to become more efficient? How do we basically then marshal those other values and say, yeah, we could become more efficient? Absolutely. But doing that is going to hurt equity, it's going to hurt effectiveness. And so I guess that's kind of my question. And I haven't read the book yet, so maybe you've already answered it and I am late. I do apologize for that. Maybe you answered it before I got here, but that's, I guess, my question and my concern with performance management, not generally, but just as a foreseeable outcome that I've seen in several cases. And now I'll shut up and hopefully learn.
I think, Aaron, that public administration is moving beyond efficiency. So I think, efficiency is a foundational concept in terms of public administration that goes back to this essay, Woodrow Wilson wrote in the 1880s. Oh, apparently nobody read it for 50 years, but I don't know. But that represented, what was the good government movement at the time. But I think now there's much more talk of social equity. There's much more talk about, let's say what competencies kids are coming out of school, with a sense, about how you can improve people's lives, not just, sort of process them, in a way. I think you see it in the Boston mayoral, election. The new mayor, Michelle Wu, I think she's got a broader agenda there, which is more value-based, in a sense. So, I think the dialogue has become much broader, in a way. You see it on the progressive side of the Democratic Party, since I think efficiency is a prerequisite. You can't really expect much of government if it can't be efficient. But I think we have come to a point where the impacts are much more apparent all the time, and the unintended impacts, so the negative consequences, are also much more apparent. And to me, I think that indicates that the emphasis we have in terms of performance, which is broad, is exactly where we should be, and that we moved away from simply we're line item budgets and just what does this cost, what does that cost, in a sense, to performance budgets, and politicians are, I think, starting to spout more language in terms of of impacts on quality of life and such. So that to me augurs well for a performance emphasis. And I think everything we have in the book really addresses all those factors, right, that need to be mastered in order to have a high performing society. And ultimately, that links to trust. That people need to trust government, and then they'll be willing to put their resources, known as taxes, into government. So that would be an ascending spiral. And I wrote some of this with Kai Fang years ago in the trust performance connection. But I think that's what it comes to. If we're going to support government, and I think I'm hopeful that that's really where our societies, not just in the U.S., might be going. That we need to be sophisticated about what we've really promised people in terms of quality of life. Not just that they hear, that they're present, but if you go back to the foundational documents in public administration, the constitutions, the charters, the legislation, the regulations, the speeches, and the legislation, all, say people have been promised a lot. And it's much more than just efficiency. So that's where, if we connect performance to all of that, to delivering as promised, then I think we're in a stronger position as a society, in a stronger position in terms of being advocates for performance.
It's a really excellent point, Aaron, and I think I mean, it's like the question for new public management. I think it's we're not a business, and we want to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the way we do it. But our role is to serve the public, and I think it's important for us to collectively acknowledge that there are indeed cases where we knowingly sacrifice efficiency for equity and access, and transportation, as you mentioned, is the perfect example of that. If you were to run, so for example, if New Jersey Transit were to run purely as a business, they would cut the vast majority of their last mile connector buses that connect historically underserved communities to public transit hubs. And I think we risk I think the extreme example of where this can lead stems from the CompStat sort of explosion in police. And if you look at a city like Miami Gardens, which has 1/10 the population of the city of Miami, but did 90,000 random stop and frisks over a 3-year period compared to like 6,000 that the city of Miami did, because they were so metric oriented. That, and the same with the New York City Police Department. I mean, it is the grand failure, I think, of the performance system, the New York City Police Department, where there are God knows how many class action lawsuits and constitutional crises that their performance system has created, purely in the effort to sort of hit your metrics. So I think we have to acknowledge that government services are an extension of our community values, and the performance management systems that we attach to those should also be an extension of those values. City of San Francisco, for example, monitors the retention rate of users of the Clean Power San Francisco initiative, which is a sort of a consortium of clean power operators to deliver renewable energy. Costs the city an enormous amount of money. It is not very efficient, but they want people to adopt it because it meets sort of larger societal and community goals that are aligned with the values of those communities. So it's really tricky, and I think what sort of the line of conversation that has sort of weaved through this entire thing, which is it's not all about numbers and not all about metrics. That is sort of the perennial danger that we face in performance. And I think there are plenty of examples of how it can go wrong. And maybe it's just up to us to promote the examples of when it could be done, correctly or right.
Aroon, do you have any words on this as well?
Yeah, so I mean, continuing to with what I said, the previous question, right? The conversation and with the stakeholders, there should be this narrative from the performance division, and what Marc and Andrew shared are really good points. There should be somebody who is like who is really not really a performance officer, but somebody who actually can create that story and that narrative to the citizens. And it could be in any form. It could be maybe a PI or a public information officer or storyteller, and keeping the citizens engaged. That's important. And providing the narrative, especially in this data age that we need to create a narrative that the citizens can understand. And storytelling is just an example. So keeping the citizens in the loop is important. So that would be my addition. Yeah. Thanks.
I think that's a wonderful way to kind of end this conversation. And I think that this has been really fantastic. And I know, Marc, you have to leave. And I just want to end by saying thank you so much to all three of you for taking time and talking about your new book, excuse me, the Public Productivity and Performance Handbook. So I'm just going to leave another link in the talk. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Seth, for hosting this.